The next issue I think is one that's personally close to my heart because I've experienced this myself. And so when Ryan and I talked about this organization, I think it's really important work that Ann is doing. So we're very pleased to welcome Ann today. So Ann is the CEO of Action Against Stalking. Her professional background is in psychology and clinical behavioral psychotherapy training and development. But in March 2009, she showed enormous courage and commitment when she spoke out publicly about her own experience of being the victim of a stalker and the support systems that had really failed her. So she was determined that stalking should be recognized as a criminal offense within Scottish law, so she set about challenging decision makers. And in doing so, she's launched not only a national but also international campaign really against stalking. And she succeeded in getting a change in the UK and European law. And I don't think you've ever tried to change laws. This is not an easy thing to do, so it takes enormous commitment, willpower, perseverance, all kinds of things that are really difficult. So I'm hoping she'll tell us about that piece of her life. Her determination and focus has resulted in the launch of the UK National Stalking Awareness Day, and she continues to lead the way in advancing the recognition of stalking, championing the rights of victims across the globe. She delivers training to all kinds of groups, including police, victims groups, government officials, and so forth, and she has spoken at many, many different organizations. And she's received so many awards, like our first speaker. If I gave all the awards she's received, we'd be here all afternoon, but I just wanted to mention one because I personally think this would be really meaningful. She can tell me whether or not this is one. The Emma Humphreys Memorial Prize for Outstanding Individual Achievement towards helping stop violence against women, which for the first time this UK national award has been won by a Scots woman. And I think that's just a tremendous accomplishment. So please join me in welcoming Ann Moulds to the platform.
It's an absolute honour and a privilege and humbling to be invited here to speak today. Never really described myself as an inspirational woman, but I probably would describe myself as stubborn, determined, and I will definitely stand up for what I believe in. When people say to me, "It must have been terrible," I say, yes, it was. When they say to me, "What was the worst part?" I say, take your pick. And when they say, "What made you stand up and speak out?" I say, I'm a woman and I was pissed off and I am out of estrogen. And there really is something in that, isn't there? But over the past few years, 4 major issues of public protection and social justice have come to the fore. The first was stalking, a crime that prevails within every aspect of our society. Stalking is the repeated, unwanted intrusion of one person into the life of another in a manner that causes untold disruption, damage, anxiety, fear and distress, and left unattended can soon escalate to sexual assault, rape, physical violence and even death. The recognition of stalking set the platform for domestic abuse, child abuse, coercion and control to follow suit. And all share in common that they are widespread, harmful and discriminatory behaviours towards which society had previously chose to turn a blind eye. Violence comes in many forms, some more visible than others, and unfortunately, emotional abuse and trauma was one variety that faded into the background like a wallflower at a dance, at the newspaper headlines where death, physical violence and suicide took centre stage. But because we could not materialise the subjective, we chose instead to deny its existence. And this was not just a failing of the criminal justice system, but society as a whole. Today I want to share with you some of my story of what it was like to be a victim of a stalker and forced to engage in a criminal justice system, and in doing so highlight some of the triggers that made me stand up and speak out. You see, I have been the victim of crime on 2 separate occasions and forced to engage in the criminal justice system, and both times I was let down badly. My first experience was in 1999 when 2 armed and masked men broke into the home that I shared with my 15-year-old daughter and subjected us to a brutal and violent assault and threatened us with death. because we wouldn't tell them where the safe was kept. There was no safe. It wasn't us they were after. We had just bought the house, and the criminal grapevine hadn't told these men that the person who bought the house from had just moved, taking his safe with them. The police responded well. After all, they were treading a well-worn path, and disgusted that two men could commit such a terrible act towards a mother and her daughter, were determined to find and bring these men to justice. The men were eventually arrested and charged, along with enough evidence to put them away for a long time, but the case was dropped and the men walked free. I was informed of this via a very brief and curt telephone call from an unnamed person in the Procurator Fiscal's office. I sought an explanation, answers, but none were forthcoming. And with little or no help or support, I was left to cope with the aftermath of the trauma and the harm done to myself and that of my 15-year-old daughter. It was 3 years before I was able to work again. 2 years later, I discovered purely by chance that the case had fallen through because of forensic error, and no one had the decency to tell me the truth. I thought I had experienced the worst imaginable, but I was wrong. 4 years later, my home had yet again become a target, this time of a stalker, a sadistic sexual predatory stalker who chose to remain anonymous throughout his 2-year campaign of unrelenting terror. And when I tried to stop it, I couldn't. And when I tried to find help, there was none. This man, whoever he was, had forced himself into some delusional relationship with me without my knowing or without my consent. And the impact this was having on every aspect of my life was every bit as cruel as the sickening act that I was to be part of. What started with a simple but filthy Valentine's Day card in 2004 soon escalated to sexually deviant photographs. Photographs of a man dressed in women's lingerie, setting the scene, and these he posted to me. He would also send me items of women's lingerie through the post. Silent phone calls in the middle of the night. I knew he was watching me. He told me so in his letters that he sent me, outlining a slow and unfolding violent and sadistic fantasy of bondage, rape and torture, that he believed would one day be his reality and I would enjoy it. He said it's what I had been waiting for all my life. Such was his delusion. He had even chosen his location. You see, my stalker knew all about me, but I knew nothing about him. And because I didn't know who this was, it soon became everyone. Eventually too scared to go out, his freedom became my incarceration, and living with constant fear, anxiety, uncertainty soon took its toll on every aspect of my life. I was suffering from nervous exhaustion. I was struggling to work, to run my business, or what was left of it by this point. It was the hunter and the hunted. Mental health and physical health are inextricably interlinked. I lost weight. My hair started to fall out. I was suffering from uncontrollable migraines, sometimes being hospitalised, gum abscesses, chest pains. I was scared that I was going to have a heart attack or a stroke. I didn't think I was going to survive this, aware that I might not. And I watched helplessly as every aspect of my life slowly started to crumble, and there was nothing that I could do to stop it. Whenever I tried to report to the police, I was met with dismissive, gender-based, derogatory and victim-blaming attitudes, poor advice and no information. You see, the stalking presented a completely different type of crime from the robbery and elicited a completely different type of response. But just because it didn't tick a box or fit into the paradigm of retrospective policing and investigation, or the police didn't understand it, didn't mean it was an excuse to ignore it. At that time, predatory behaviour, psychological impact and mental abuse held no legitimate status within criminal law. But far too often a look into the past actions of a stalker can be a frightening glimpse into how the present stalking will end. And there is another point worth mentioning as well. Engaging with the criminal justice system automatically allocated me the identity of a victim, a value-based judgment label accompanied by stereotypical assumptions upon which attitudes were based. And I was made to feel that I had invited this into my life. The police reckoned it must have been some ex-boyfriend and he would soon get fed up and go away. Not what the experts say. I was told, being single and female, I must have been out there attracting the wrong type, bringing into disrepute my personal and social activities. They were in fact wrong, but it made no difference. I had other preferred identities, but these were disregarded. I was in fact a very able and professional person with a background in psychology, clinical behavioural psychotherapy. I had a comprehensive understanding of this type of stalking pathology, yet no matter how hard I tried to desperately point out the warning signs, neatly written in his handwritten letters, my voice, my worth was ignored, and I was constantly reminded he would have to attack me first before anything could be done. Psychological harm and emotional abuse is no less destructive, no less damaging, and no less serious as crimes of a physical nature, and the state could no longer give precedence of one over the other. Unfortunately, stalkers identify themselves as potential perpetrators before the fact, giving the authorities the opportunity to actually intervene and stop the violence before it happens. Regretfully, many stalking victims are regularly denied such early intervention and assistance like me, and left to fend for themselves, often with tragic results. Eventually, through my own efforts, my stalker was identified and charged under the common law breach of the peace and a trial set for a sheriff's summary. No big deal then, but at least I thought my nightmare was over. But how wrong I was. He still continued his lewd behaviour. He was never going to give up. The police didn't even think it was worth recording the ongoing activity. They didn't even think it was worth bothering about, giving my stalker the benefit of the doubt yet again. It took 15 months for my case to come to trial, 15 months in which my stalker played the system to his advantage, and at the last minute he chose to enter into a plea bargain process. I would like to have attended the court where the full extent and range of his behaviours would have been open to the judgment of the court. But unlike my stalker, I was denied that opportunity. Imagine, just for 1 minute, how would you feel to be denied access to justice, have everything taken away from you, including your basic human rights, and be denied any way of challenging that or even gaining a hearing in normal courts? Not because you have been charged or convicted of any crime, but because the adversarial justice model mandates the state as the victim, and any ownership of the crime is usurped by the state. During sentencing, I sat as a spectator listening as the defence put forward a strong plea for mercy, presenting my stalker as a good citizen, a hard-working person who had made nothing more than an innocent mistake, and he apologised to the courts for that mistake. The unanimous view exists that for punishment to be morally acceptable in a democratic and just society, punishment has to be proportional to the injury or the harm done. Good decisions require the appraisal of all the information available. To this day, the sheriff doesn't know what I look like. He has never heard my voice, or what it was like for me, or my role in society as an upstanding citizen, a good mother, a hard worker, and I never received an apology. And in spite of a social work report stating a risk of reoffending, the sheriff, in his opinion, decided that my stalker was not a danger to the public, and with a lenient sentence, my stalker walked out of court free. When I left court that day, I realised my safety, my life, or the mere fact I was the other half of that crime was of no interest to those working within the criminal justice system, and the lasting harm caused by both the crime and the system appeared to be regarded as utterly beside the point. When crimes are committed and perpetrators are brought to justice, and ideally appropriate sentencing is delivered, generating the illusion that things are under control and social order prevails, the system codifies and perpetuates both. No one would guarantee that my stalker would respect his court orders. I'd already been attacked in my own home, and I was in no mood to be attacked a second time. So to gain a sense of safety, I relocated over 18 miles away, and in doing so, I lost my home, I lost my business, I left behind my friends and my family, while my stalker walked the streets where I once lived. My stalker had reduced me to nothing more than an object of his sick, sadistic sexual fantasy, and the system tacitly colluded to reduce me to nothing more than a piece of evidence, with neither care or concern for the harm and suffering that they both caused. And if the state cannot acknowledge the harm caused by another person's actions, then there is little chance the offender will too. I experienced a system that models the very behaviour that our society deems unacceptable, the misuse of power to the detriment of others. And how can we ensure the recognition of the victim when the state itself is an offender? As Erasmus Darwin stated, he who allows the oppression shares the crime. I believe in justice, and I believe what happened to me was not justice, and I held firm to my belief that justice does exist. I believe in democracy, and I'm part of that democratic process, a process brought to life by individuals and those working and represented within our governments. The democratic process is only as good as the individuals who make up the process. When I first spoke out and launched my campaign Action Scotland Against Stalking, I saw a system disconnected from those who turned to it at a time of their greatest need. Victims who had been psychologically abused, traumatised, life severely disrupted and destroyed, victims raped and murdered, some with damage too great to ever repair, victims left dehumanised and forgotten. Who is it who decides whose voice should be heard, and who holds the greater value? And what has happened to those victims who have been silenced? Who are they, and where are these people now? When victims are disbelieved, shamed and forced into silence, or when the disclosure is minimised, the trauma inflicted by both the system and the perpetrator by willful ignorance compounds the original trauma, relegating victims to a world of silence, subjected to living endangering a speechless terror that hinders both the individual and social adjustment, and thus supporting the stalker's goal to cloak their victims in a cloak of darkness, despair and desperation, making them believe that there is no one out there to help them, to believe them and to stop this horrific behaviour. They steal their voices and they make it hard for these victims to be heard. So I lent them mine, even though I was still scared and vulnerable myself. But as Ambrose Redman once said, courage is not the absence of fear, but rather that judgment is something else more important than fear. And I pledge that what happened to me must never be allowed to happen to another person. I pledged I would be the voice of those who were too scared or unable to speak out for themselves. And I was determined that stalking should be recognised as a distinct and serious crime within Scottish law. But also to bring about the attention of to the decision makers how the system dehumanises victims. I was determined that victims of crime should have an identity and a voice within the justice process. The year was 2009. My campaign was called Action Scotland Against Stalking. I didn't need to raise £1,000 to have a voice. I already had one, and skills and knowledge and experience, and I had enough understanding to know that pointing and blaming at any particular individual or agency serves no useful purpose. Otherwise, I would become enmeshed as part of the problem. I realised I was close enough to the situation to be involved with both the problem and the solution. But I had to find a way that would allow me to act and to remain free with legitimacy rather than and express a humanitarian concern rather than be inhibited and governed by the complexities of forming and running a charity with all its inherent responsibility and legal governance, not to mention the constant soul destroying of chasing funding, of which there was no guarantee. It was actually easier to fund it myself, even if that meant holding down 3 jobs while retaining professional and personal accountability, not just for myself, but also for those victims that I had chosen to represent. It was a daunting task, but the point has to be made that a campaign run and no outside funding requires an overwhelming belief that this change not only can, but must be made. The drivers of justice can be the same drivers of injustice, and I had enough understanding to know that the criminal justice system, when challenged, closes ranks and goes on the defence. Therefore, it came as no surprise that the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, the Crown Office, the police, and everyone else working in the criminal justice system had no interest in what I had to say. So I had to find another way to muster support. Campaigns make news when they create change, make a difference, or threaten to do so. So as part of the resolution, it was important to involve the public, persuading people to take a position and an interest, which can only be effectively done through the media. I therefore enhanced every opportunity to gain media exposure, newspaper articles, broadcasting media, local, national and European radio, thereby reaching out to a wide audience. I put out a media call for victims to come forward and speak out with me in support of change. It was a simple, unambiguous call to action, and for the first time ever, a platform had been created, encouraging free expression and the telling of their stories, instead of having to rely on the restrictions of preloaded victim voice survey questionnaires. I eventually gained the respect and recognition from other powerful bodies, victim support organisations, the Law Society in Scotland, the Church of Scotland, the National Union of Students, the NHS, to name but a few. The campaign title, Action Scotland Against Stalking, not only clearly reflected the campaign's goals, but contained 2 contextual forces. It was rhetorically a powerfully motivating call to action. I took a leap of faith, made an assumption, and it came true. I was calling on the whole of Scotland to back me, and it did eventually become the whole of Scotland. You see, people are more receptive to calls for action when the messages emphasise the benefits of that action and people perceive others as taking action also. and eventually I captured the attention of those working within the political spectrum. The powerful impact of my campaign led to the introduction of my proposed model anti-stalking legislation to meet the second hearing of the Criminal Justice and Licensing Bill. But the Scottish Government had their own ideas, and rather than accept my proposal for a singular stalking offence, attempted to subsume my stalking into their own model legislation, a wide-ranging prohibition piece of legislation now known as Section 38 of the Criminal Justice and Licensing Scotland Act, threatening and abusive behaviour. It was in effect a statutory breach of the peace, similar to the 1997 Harassment Act, operational in England and Wales. Overlooking the fact that stalking is not harassment, it has a different mode, motive and perspective, and a failure to clear up any confusion between two very similar but completely different concepts would actually lead to more problems than is set out to solve. In an unprecedented move, the Justice Committee called for evidence giving during the second session of the parliamentary hearing. And a key turning point was not only did the Justice Committee dismiss the government's proposed legislation on the grounds of constitutional vagueness, but saw how it could be integrated into my model legislation as a lower test case offence, thereby closing all loopholes and gaps that stalkers might find a way to wriggle through. The introduction of the offence of stalking into the Criminal Justice and Licensing Act, Scotland Act, was a landmark victory. It is a clear, concise, robust piece of legislation and one of the most powerful pieces of legislation in the world today. In 2010, the campaign went to England and Wales. I met with key officials from the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice. They had already established the 1997 Harassment Act, while effective for a wide range of crimes, could not accommodate the crime of stalking. It was indeed ineffective, and nobody had ever taken the decision to review it in its 15 years of enforcement. They were determined to follow our lead, and in 2012 England and Wales introduced two new offences of stalking into the Protections of Freedoms Act of 2012. But stalking is a global crime, existence in every country on this earth, and with the advancement of technology is increasingly crossing national and international borders. So in 2010 I took the campaign to Europe and lobbied for stalking to be recognised a crime across all European states. It was no mean feat. In 2011, stalking was introduced as a Section 34 into the Council of Europe's European Convention against Violence Against Women and Children. The treaty was ratified in August 2014 and placing a requirement on all member states to codify stalking into criminal law. And collectively, these pieces of legislation herald the transformation from a tacit acceptance of what on the surface appears to be slightly annoying behaviour to the recognition that stalking is actually a dangerous, deviant social syndrome. And a welcome success of the legislation was giving the victims a voice, where the gravamen of the offence is the impact on the victim and not on the behaviours per se. You see, stalking is a perfect petri dish for understanding interpersonal violence. The offence of stalking and its classification as a victim-defined crime has been a major step forward in advancing the rights of victims. And we have been instrumental in driving forward major breakthroughs and groundbreaking initiatives, not just here in Scotland, but across the UK and also across Europe. The biggest threat to our human rights is stalking, and the second is our response to it. Because legislation on its own was never going to be enough, could never be enough. The passage of a bill doesn't bring any guarantee on its implementation or how it will work on the ground. Because without education, training, protocols and guidelines, stalkers would continue to operate outside the purview of the criminal justice system, allowing their behaviour to continue unchecked, with devastating consequences for victims, making individual and community safety an unattainable goal. And even without legislative reform, these were still necessary requirements. It was important, therefore, to understand what stalking is and what constitutes the crime, and to look beyond a single incident or breach in standards to the underlying dynamics and patterns of harm. Because in order to dramatically reduce the number of people being stalked, we needed to dramatically increase the number of stalkers who were being convicted. And so the work continued to help bridge the gap between awareness and understanding, between legislation and legislative reform. I've delivered training to police, criminal justice professionals, NHS, educational institutions, victim support agencies across the UK and on the international stage. We've continued to develop our partnership working with Crown Office officials, police, victim support services, but both at home and south of the border. We have launched stalking awareness raising campaigns, public education, national distribution of leaflets and posters, and the development of community-based projects that can be unrolled nationally. We have promoted the introduction of stalking policies into schools, into colleges and universities, the NHS and local authorities, and worked with the private organisation to raise awareness to help address workplace stalking. And I have presented as key speaker at conferences, delivered workshops, training, both at home and on the European platform. And we have been instrumental in progressing the issue of stalking across all European member states. And working closely with the European Commission and the Council of Europe, we have consulted in many developments in Scotland and abroad regarding stalking and improving response to victims. In 2012, the European Commission launched the European Protection Orders, offering protection for victims of predatory crimes, regardless where they live, where they move to, or where they reside. In 2011, I launched the UK's first national stalking group. This powerful working group, represented by a wide range of statutory and voluntary organisations, it was a major step forward in helping driving forward change within and across the public sections of our society. And I was determined to keep stalking within the public consciousness, and in 2012 I launched the first UK National Stalking Awareness Day. This historical event saw 3 countries, Scotland, England and Wales, unite to adopt a zero tolerance approach to stalking, marking the formation of Britain's first UK-wide stalking alliance. Portugal joined us in 2014, which marked the start of a European approach to stalking awareness, and other countries are following suit. And this year I'm back on the European platform with 2 objectives in mind: to promote a unified concept of stalking and ultimately a harmonised legal framework across all European member states. And secondly, to convince the European Commission and the Parliament to join the UK and adopt an official European Stalking Awareness Week. And a landmark victory in 2014, the Crown Office and Police Scotland raised the profile of stalking to a high priority listed crime. The appointment of their new Crown Office National Lead for Stalking, the unrolling of a national training strategy for all Crown Office and Crown Office personnel, the development of specialised knowledge through accredited training programmes, coupled with the implementation of a robust response protocol and prosecution policy, has ensured the implementation of the legislation was supported by state cooperation. And it is only now that we're starting, that's the European statistics for the stalking, and it's only now that we're starting to strengthen the links between stalking and other forms of serious violence. Stalking is a crime that spans the gamut of some of the worst forms of violence known to another human being. It's a crime that prevails within every aspect of our society, our workplaces, our colleges, our universities, in our communities and in our personal lives. But stalking isn't a physical crime per se. It's a psychological crime denoted by the impact on its victim. And any physical crime is purely a facet of the crime. And when it escalates to rape, violence, murder, usually the perpetrator is prosecuted for another crime and the stalking element is overlooked. When people suffer any form of violation against them, they suffer as a whole human being. The emotional, the cognitive, the spiritual suffering cannot be completely separated from all other kinds of suffering. And victims of crime, rather than being viewed as just pieces of evidence, also have something valuable to offer. They offer a rich source of information, because without feedback from those who have experienced the criminal justice system, experienced crime, how can the criminal justice system and all its allied support organisations truly judge whether the time, money and energy which has been invested in recent times in changes to statute, policies, guidelines and procedures has actually made a difference, and whether that difference is consistent across the system? We have created that bottom-up feedback mechanism with great success. There is no crime without a victim. The two are inextricably interlinked, and being involved in the criminal justice system provided my stalker with a pathway and a measure of protection to ensure his human rights are upheld, to be entitled to a fair trial, to be treated with respect and dignity, and sparing him a jail sentence served to protect his anonymity. I was the other half of that crime. I was the one who initiated the justice process, yet he had a voice and mine was silence. Access to justice should be the right of every citizen. It is essential that victims have a right to participate in the justice process. Participation is the right on which the exercise of all other rights rest and depends. Respect and dignity for victims is key to obtaining that participation. Crime results in harm to victims, communities and to offenders, and rather than threatening their rights, will give them the opportunity and to acknowledge the consequences of their actions against another individual, and not just as an act against the state. This shift has seen the enshrinement of victims' rights into statutory law through the introduction of the Government's Victims and Witnesses Act in 2014. It's a landmark victory, and because for the first time ever, victims now have a set of rights within criminal law. But due to its ongoing and persistent nature, stalking victims are among the world's most vulnerable victims of crime, the most traumatised victims of crime. So within this Act, when this Act was being drafted, and I sat in the Victims and Witness Collaboration Forum to overview the drafting of this bill, I made sure that victims of stalking were recognised as a specific and separate category of highly vulnerable victims and automatically entitled to special measures within a criminal court of law when they stand as a witness. The Scottish offence of stalking is supported and supports by a recent wave of new pieces of government legislative reforms which aims to tackle psychological harm and abuse. Abusive Behaviour and Sexual Harms Act in Scotland, that was in 2016. We've now got the Domestic Abuse Act, we have got the Coercion and Hand Control Act, and we have got the Malicious Communications Act in Scotland. And these have all come off the back of the stalking legislation. But as with all other psychological crimes and abusive crimes, that systematic pattern of behaviour and the complex interpersonal dynamics that underpin psychological harm, they don't translate well into the existing adversarial model of justice that we have in our country today. And so the introduction of the Scottish Government's Criminal Justice Scotland Bill was introduced with that in mind, and it was to try and accommodate victims' rights and victims within the justice process, and also to try and balance the rights of a suspect accused with the rights of the victims to access justice. It has been major reforms and a major step forward. But in my mind, it is an ambitious piece of legislation because it is still the criminal justice system. And the clue lies in the title, criminal. It's a system that has been designed specifically to protect those who have committed crime or who are being accused of crime. And our courts of justice have a legal obligation to uphold the offender's rights over and above that of the victims. Rights can only be effectively implemented within a framework of a comprehensive new paradigm. If we really are to support victims' rights, recognise the victim and treat the victim with respect and dignity as the other half of that crime, victims will still be marginalised and the status quo will continue to exist. Crime is more than just an offence against the state or against society. Access to justice should be the right of every citizen. The laws of the land are designed to represent the rights of the people, the individuals who make up our communities and society as a whole. It's the victims of crime who represent and present the harm of the perpetration that crime inflicts on society and the individual, and not just the state. So my question I'm going to leave with you today is, are the recently introduced victims' rights mere refinements of the current existing justice system, or should they be considered as expressions of a new way of thinking, which is incompatible with the basic structure of the traditional model of administering criminal justice? Is it time for a complete paradigm shift, where we abandon the concept of crime as an infringement of state criminal laws, and instead of a criminal justice paradigm, reinterpret psychological abuse and harm within a framework of a human rights violation paradigm? Have a think about it. The justice system represents all, while the criminal justice system does not. I think simply just calling it the justice system would at least be a major step forward in direction in terms of creating an atmosphere that is equal to both criminals and to victims. But for this to happen, we must continue to work together to effect this shift, both in essence and in substance. I believe that we are all standing at the forefront of change. We can all be part of that change individually and collectively. The pendulum has been swinging. It will never go back again. But we have still got to keep working together and moving forward to help make change happen. Thank you.